Please, Your Honor, don't send me back. The little girl's voice quivers, barely louder than a whisper, but the desperation in her eyes silences the entire courtroom. Across from her, a powerful businessman adjusts his gold cufflinks, smirking. He's done this before, and he knows the system will protect him. But when the judge slams his gavel and orders the courtroom locked down, something shifts. Papers shuffle, murmurs ripple through the gallery. For the first time, someone is listening. For the first time, the truth might come out. How deep does this corruption go? And will justice finally be served for this little girl? If you've ever felt that the system protects the powerful over the innocent, tell us where you're watching from. Stay with us, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The early morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of Courtroom 3, casting long beams of light onto the polished marble floor. Despite the warmth outside, the atmosphere inside was heavy, almost suffocating. Conversations had died down to hushed whispers as everyone took their seats. At the front of the room, Judge Samuel Carter took his place behind the imposing bench. His presence alone commanded respect. He had seen thousands of cases in his time, some tragic, some infuriating. But today, something in his gut told him this was different. He couldn't quite place it yet, but there was a weight in the air, a tension simmering beneath the surface. The heavy courtroom doors swung open. A tiny girl, no older than 9, stepped inside. Elena Brooks was barely more than a shadow against the grandeur of the courtroom. Her frame was thin, swallowed by a faded blue dress that hung loosely off her small shoulders. Her hands gripped the fabric so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes, wide, dark, and filled with terror, darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could save her. A bailiff moved forward, preparing to lead her to the other side of the courtroom. The moment he stepped toward her, she jerked backward, shaking her head violently. Then a single, desperate cry pierced the silent room. "Please, Your Honor, please don't send me back!" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some shifted in their seats, others exchanged uneasy glances. A woman in the back clutched her chest. The weight of Elena's plea settled like a stone in the center of the room. Seated at the defense table, Victor Lancaster exhaled slowly, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his sleeves with practiced ease. He was a man of power, of influence. His tailored black suit was impeccable, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly back. To the casual observer, he exuded confidence. To those who knew better, it was something far more dangerous: arrogance. Beside him, his attorney, Paul Winslow, rose smoothly from his chair. His tone was polite, measured, even condescending. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a misunderstanding. The child has an overactive imagination. There is no evidence to support these wild accusations." The words hung in the air, thick with dismissal. Elena's breath hitched. She turned frantically, scanning the faces around her. No one moved. No one spoke. She had seen this before, this exact moment where the world decided not to listen. The bailiff stepped forward again. This time, when his hand reached for her, she bolted. She ran, not toward the exit, but toward the judge's bench. Before anyone could react, she latched onto the edge of the wooden structure, clutching it like it was the only thing keeping her afloat in a storm. Tears streaked her cheeks, her voice raw with desperation. "No, don't let him take me. Please, he hurts kids." A suffocating silence filled the room. The bailiff hesitated. Even Paul Winslow, the ever-composed attorney, shifted uncomfortably. At the defense table, Victor Lancaster's smirk faltered. It was brief, so quick that most wouldn't have caught it, but Judge Carter did. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto Victor, watching, assessing. Something inside him stirred. His fingers gripped the gavel. Bang! The strike of the gavel thundered through the courtroom. "No one is leaving this room until I get the truth." A tense murmur erupted in the gallery. A woman gasped. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." Judge Carter turned to the bailiff. "Lock the doors." A second later, the unmistakable sound of heavy locks clicking into place echoed through the chamber. The finality of it sent a chill through the room. The courtroom had just been sealed shut. The weight of Elena's words still hung thick in the air. Judge Samuel Carter sat motionless for a moment, his fingers pressing lightly against the wooden bench. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint rustling of papers as the court clerk entered, her arms laden with an imposing stack of manila folders. She placed them carefully in front of him, her movements quick, precise. A few papers slid slightly out of place, edges curling as if resisting the truth that had long been buried. Judge Carter exhaled sharply and reached for the topmost file. Elena Brooks, foster care records. He flipped through the pages. One report, then another, and another. Neglect, malnutrition, unexplained bruises. Each complaint, each desperate attempt to raise the alarm had been systematically stamped with the same chilling words. Case closed. No action taken. Carter's grip on the folder tightened. His years on the bench had exposed him to countless injustices, but something about this felt deliberate. Not mere incompetence, but a system designed to ignore the most vulnerable. He turned another page. His gaze froze. A different name. A different case. But the pattern was identical. Liam Evans, missing persons report. His fingers traced the bolded letters. The date of placement. The name of the foster guardian. Victor Lancaster. Carter's pulse quickened. The boy had been placed in Lancaster's custody, and then, just like that, he was gone. There was a single police report from the initial disappearance, a weak attempt at an inquiry. But within days, the case had been marked runaway. No further investigation. Another child lost. Another silence bought. The room felt colder. Carter slowly lifted his gaze from the papers and turned his attention toward Victor Lancaster. Lancaster sat unnervingly still. The arrogance hadn't left his face, but something else flickered beneath the surface. His fingers tapped, a rhythmic, almost calculated motion, against the polished wood of the defense table. It was subtle, but Carter saw it. A tell. The judge leaned back slightly, pressing the folder closed with slow deliberation. A deep unease settled in his chest. He turned to the small, trembling girl at the witness stand. Elena. His voice was steady, measured, but no longer just authoritative. There was something else there now, a quiet, urgent resolve. Tell me everything. For a moment, Elena's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her tiny fingers twisted into the fabric of her dress. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to push away the flood of memories threatening to pull her under. Then, the dam holding back her nightmares finally began to crack. Elena's breath hitched the moment Judge Carter spoke her name. Her body curled inward, instinctively retreating from the weight of his gaze. Her small fingers twisted into the fabric of her dress, knuckles turning white. She wanted to answer. She knew she had to, but the words felt stuck, lodged deep in her throat. Her eyes flickered across the room, landing on the heavy, locked courtroom doors. There was no way out. The past didn't ask for permission. It came crashing back, unrelenting. A dark room, stale air, the sharp bite of cold against her skin. The walls pressed in around her, the silence suffocating. The only light came from the thin sliver beneath the locked door, a narrow escape for dust and shadows. She stared at it, willing it to widen, to break open, to save her. But then, the sound came. Heavy footsteps, slow, purposeful. Each step sent a shiver through her spine. She knew that rhythm. She knew what it meant. They stopped, just inches away. Close enough that she could hear the shift of his weight, the way his shoes scuffed against the floor. Close enough that she could feel him there, waiting. Then the voice. Low, amused, cruel. No one will believe you. I can do whatever I want. Her breath stilled. The memory was so real she could feel the air shift outside the door, hear the way his breath caught slightly before he spoke. Even now, even here, his words slithered into her bones. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping her dress tighter, as if the fabric could anchor her to the present. She hadn't spoken a word back then. She hadn't dared. Would anyone have listened, even if she had? The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. A juror wiped at his eyes. A woman in the gallery turned her face away, her lips pressed together to hold back a sob. Even the bailiff, the one who had kept his composure all morning, stood rigid, fists clenched tightly at his sides. But Elena saw none of it. She was still trapped in that room, still waiting for the door to creak open, still waiting for the nightmare to begin again. The heavy doors of the courtroom creaked open. A woman stepped inside. Heads turned. A quiet murmur rippled through the room as some people leaned in, whispering. Others frowned, confused. Even Judge Carter's gaze sharpened as he studied her. She hesitated just beyond the threshold, fingers gripping a thick, battered folder against her chest. Her knuckles were pale, her breath unsteady. Then she stepped forward. Grace Holloway. Carter recognized the name immediately. A former social worker, once respected, who had resigned abruptly 2 years ago. Her eyes flickered to Elena. A quiet sorrow settled there. Then she turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she began, but her voice wavered. She exhaled sharply, tightening her grip on the folder. "I used to work for Child Protective Services." Silence. The words carried a weight heavier than they should have. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Victor Lancaster, then back to Carter. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say more, but she hesitated. "I quit." The statement lingered in the air, stark and unshakable. Grace wet her lips, then repeated it, as if she needed to hear it aloud to believe it herself. "I quit," she said again, this time steadier, "because I couldn't live with what I knew." Slowly she stepped forward and placed the folder on the judge's bench. Gently. Carefully. As if what lay inside was more than paper and ink, as if it held ghosts. Carter hesitated before reaching for it. Grace inhaled shakily, but her voice was firmer now. "This system," she started, her frustration barely restrained, "was never broken. It was built this way, to protect people like him." She lifted her chin, looking straight at Victor. People who don't just slip through the cracks, they own the cracks. They pay to make sure no one ever looks too closely. Victor Lancaster had been sitting perfectly still. Too still. Then, for just a second, his fingers paused mid-tap against the polished wood of the defense table. Just for a second. Then the motion resumed, smooth as ever. Carter exhaled sharply, flipping open the folder. And there it was. Bank statements. Transaction after transaction. Large withdrawals. Always in cash. Always just days before a foster child in his care disappeared. Court documents. Complaints that had been dismissed without a second glance. Reports that had never even been filed. Names. Liam Evans, Sophie Turner, Michael Hayes. Too many names. Too many children. Carter's chest tightened as he turned the pages, the magnitude of what he was seeing sinking in. Grace stepped back, her voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. "This isn't just about Elena. It's not just about one monster." She turned to the courtroom, her gaze sweeping across the faces of those who had looked away for too long. "It's about a system that let him exist, that let him thrive." The room had changed. It was no longer just a courtroom. It was a crime scene. And Victor Lancaster sat at its center. For the first time since the hearing began, Victor Lancaster lost control. The carefully constructed arrogance, the quiet smirk, the effortless confidence, cracked. It was subtle at first. His fingers, once tapping rhythmically against the polished table, froze mid-motion. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching near his temple. The smirk that had never quite left his face, gone. His eyes flickered to the file in Judge Carter's hands, just a brief glance. Quick, calculated. Then, the question came. "Mr. Lancaster," Carter's voice was calm, deliberate. "Tell me about Liam Evans." The air in the courtroom shifted. Victor's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. Not enough for most to notice, but Carter did. So did Grace. So did Elena. For a split second, the courtroom held its breath. Victor exhaled slowly through his nose, his expression a carefully controlled mask. "Liam Evans?" His voice was smooth, too measured. He leaned back slightly, feigning ease, but his grip remained locked. The rich leather of the chair creaked softly under the pressure of his fingers. "I don't recall a Liam Evans." A single, strained pause. Carter didn't blink, didn't move. "You were his foster guardian. He disappeared while in your care." A flicker of something passed through Victor's eyes. A tell. He swallowed, barely noticeable, but Carter caught it. Victor's tongue darted out, wetting his lips. Another sign. Small, inconsequential to most. But to a judge who had spent decades studying liars, it was deafening. Then came the chuckle. Short, breathless, forced. "Your Honor, I've had many foster children over the years." The practiced arrogance tried to creep back into his tone, but it wavered. "I can't be expected to remember every single one." But this time, his voice didn't carry the same effortless charm. This time, his words felt hollow, and everyone in the room could feel it. A chair scraped against the floor. The sudden noise snapped through the courtroom like a whip, drawing every eye toward the prosecution table. David Fisher, the prosecutor, was on his feet. His face was pale, his grip white-knuckled around a small flash drive. "Your Honor," his voice was tight, urgent. "We have something." Judge Carter's brow furrowed. He studied Fisher for a long second, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Then, with a small nod, he gestured for him to proceed. Fisher moved quickly, handing the flash drive to the bailiff, who carried it across the silent courtroom. The screen at the front flickered to life as the file loaded. The image was grainy, distorted by static. A dimly lit room. A boy, no older than 10, hunched in a corner, his knees drawn to his chest. His hoodie was torn at the sleeve. His hands clutched at the fabric, gripping it like a lifeline. His breath came in shallow gasps. His face was dirty, streaked with tears. But his eyes, wide, filled with terror, stared directly into the camera. Liam Evans. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom, the kind that pressed down on chests, made throats close. Then his whisper cut through the static. He locked me in here. The boy swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I don't know how long it's been. I think he's coming back soon. He glanced toward the door, his entire body tensing, then looked back at the camera. If someone finds this, please help me. I don't want to die here. A muffled sound in the background. Liam's breath hitched. His entire body jerked toward the noise. His fingers trembled as he scrambled closer to the camera, his face filling the screen. Please, if anyone sees this, he's going to... The screen cut to black. No ending. No resolution. Just silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even a whisper. The only sound in the entire room was the faint hum of the monitor. A woman in the gallery let out a strangled sob. Someone exhaled a sharp, shaky breath. Even the bailiff, ever composed, stood stiff, his jaw clenched. Judge Carter's eyes remained locked on the now empty screen, his expression unreadable. And then he turned to Victor Lancaster. Victor hadn't moved. His hands still rested on the arms of his chair, but his fingers had curled inward, pressing so hard against the leather that his knuckles stood out, pale and taut. His mouth opened slightly, just a fraction. His tongue flicked out, wetting his lips. A tell. For the first time, he looked afraid. For a moment, Victor Lancaster didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the darkened screen, his fingers frozen against the polished wood of the defense table. A single vein pulsed at his temple. His nostrils flared, his jaw tightened. Then the dam broke. A chair slammed backward, screeching against the marble floor as Victor shot to his feet. The sharp sound cracked through the courtroom, making several people flinch. You think you can do this to me? His voice boomed, raw with rage, shaking with disbelief. His chest heaved, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. You think you can take me down? I have more power than all of you combined. He slammed his palm against the table, rattling papers, sending a pen rolling off the edge. The mask was gone. The polished businessman, the untouchable, composed manipulator, was no more. Two court officers moved quickly, stepping forward, their hands hovering near their belts. But Victor wasn't finished. His breaths came in ragged bursts, his eyes wild as they flicked across the room, searching for something, for one last grasp of control. Then he saw her, Elena. The little girl who had dared to speak. The girl who had sat in silent terror, but now held the power to ruin him. His gaze locked onto her, his eyes dark and burning with something vile. And then he leaned in. The movement was slow, deliberate, predatory. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. His towering frame curled over her, casting a long shadow across the wooden bench where she sat. His breath, hot, rancid with fury, ghosted over her small, frozen form. You think this is over? The words slithered from his lips, barely above a whisper, but they coiled around her like a noose. Elena's fingers dug into the wood, her breath shallow, her tiny shoulders locked in place. Victor's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. You think you've won? A violent shudder rippled through her body. Her skin turned ice cold. She had heard that voice before, in the dark, outside the locked door. The weight of it crushed her, froze her in place. For the first time since stepping into that courtroom, she felt like she was back there again. Back in that room. Back where no one could hear her scream. The tension in the room stretched unbearably thin. A wire pulled so tight it was ready to snap. Victor Lancaster loomed over Elena, his words still poisoning the air between them. The little girl sat frozen, her hands gripping the bench, her breath locked somewhere inside her chest. Then, a sound. Bang! The unmistakable crack of a gavel striking wood. The entire courtroom jerked back into motion. Enough. Judge Samuel Carter's voice cut through the chaos, sharp as a blade. Slowly Victor straightened, turning his head toward the bench. His expression twisted, a grotesque mix of anger and disbelief. Carter's gaze bore into him, unwavering, cold as stone. "Justice is not for sale." His voice, steady and lethal, carried across the silent chamber. "And you, Mr. Lancaster, are done buying your way out." A beat, a moment where everything stood still. Then, the order fell. "You are under arrest. Officers, take him." The room erupted. The court officers lunged forward. Metal clinked against Victor's wrists as the cuffs snapped into place. For a split second, he didn't move. Then, he fought. "Get your hands off me!" His body twisted, muscles straining as he thrashed against their hold. "This is a joke. Do you know who I am?" The officers tightened their grip, forcing his arms behind his back. Panic flickered across his face. Real panic. For the first time, Victor Lancaster, who had always controlled the pieces on the board, was the one being taken away. Judge Carter did not flinch. He watched, impassive, as Victor was dragged toward the exit, his shouts growing wilder, more desperate. Then, the judge turned his gaze toward Elena. She still sat frozen. Small, pale, silent. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The echoes of Victor Lancaster's shouts faded as the heavy courtroom doors slammed shut behind him. The weight of his presence, his poison, his power, his fearsome shadow, was gone. For the first time, Elena could breathe. But she didn't. Her small hands were still curled into fists against the wooden bench. Her body was stiff, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She should have felt relief, but relief was foreign, unfamiliar. Then footsteps. Soft, hesitant, different. Elena's wide, fearful eyes lifted and met a face she didn't recognize. A woman stood before her. Hands trembling, tears streaking down her weathered cheeks. Her graying hair was pulled into a loose bun, wisps falling around her face, and her eyes were warm, filled with something deep and unshakable. Love. She knelt down, bringing herself to Elena's level. Her voice came out soft, broken, yet full of something that had been missing in Elena's life for so long. "Oh, my sweet girl, I've been looking for you." The words didn't make sense at first. Elena blinked, once, twice. Martha Brooks, her grandmother. A name she had heard once, long ago. A name Victor had made sure she forgot. The woman opened her arms, not demanding, not forcing, just waiting. And for the first time in her life, Elena ran toward safety, instead of away from fear. She collapsed into the woman's embrace, her small fingers gripping tightly onto the fabric of her sweater. A soft, shaky sob escaped her lips, the first she had ever allowed herself to release. And as Martha held her, rocking her gently, whispering words of love, of safety, of home, Elena finally believed them. For the first time, she felt safe. For the first time, she was free. The echoes of Victor Lancaster's struggle had long faded, his shouts swallowed by the closing doors. The courtroom was still. Judge Samuel Carter let out a slow breath, his fingers loosening their grip on the gavel. For the first time today, the storm had passed. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the sight of Elena, safe, held tightly in her grandmother's embrace. The little girl who had walked into this courtroom alone, trembling, now clung to the woman who had never stopped looking for her. For the first time, she wasn't a lost child anymore. Something in Carter's chest eased. Then, his eyes fell to the bench, a file. He frowned. It hadn't been there before. Reaching for it, he flipped it open and froze. A list of names stared back at him. Not just one, not just Elena. Dozens. Each name carried a shadow. A child who had disappeared. A child the system had failed. A child no one had come back for. Until now. His fingers traced the paper's edge, his jaw tightening. Not in anger, but in resolve. He let out a slow breath, pressing the folder shut. Victor Lancaster was gone. But the machine that had built him, that had protected him, that was still standing. And as long as it stood, so would he. Justice didn't end here. Not if he had anything to say about it. Elena sat quietly, her small frame pressed against Martha's warmth, but her mind was somewhere else. Her fingers clutched the soft fabric of her grandmother's sweater, holding on as if afraid this moment might slip through her grasp. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the courtroom window. Outside, the world looked the same. Cars moved. People walked. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the glass. But everything felt different. She was different. Her reflection stared back at her, a girl still small, still fragile, but no longer invisible, no longer alone. The shadows of her past still lingered, they always would. But today, for the first time, they didn't consume her. For the first time, there was something else. A flicker, a light, hope. A gentle hand brushed over her hair, pulling her back. Martha's voice came, thick with emotion, breaking under the weight of everything lost and everything found. "We're going home, my love." Elena didn't answer. She just nodded, pressing her face deeper into the warmth of her grandmother's arms. And for the first time in her life, home wasn't just a word. It was real. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit the like button to show your support, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that shine a light on truth, justice, and hope. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our mission to bring meaningful content that inspires and makes a difference. Together, we can ensure voices like Elena's are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.